Hey everyone, and welcome to the Private Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E. Silva. Today, joining me on the Private Podcast is Simon Sharwood. Simon is the Register's APAC editor and is based in Australia. He covers the region's news, as well as virtualization, data center infrastructure, software, cloud platforms, and more. This is a very nerdy show at the beginning, and then it gets into some other things. Welcome to the show, and now let's get over to the conversation with Simon Sharwood. Simon, thanks so much for hanging out with us here on the private podcast today. I really appreciate your time.
Hey, nice to be here.
Good stuff. So you work for the Register, which is almost certainly my favorite IT publication, if not my favorite news
Thank you.
publication ever. I have lots of fond memories for reading El Reg back in college, and since then too. I'm not in the IT industry anymore, so I don't read it as often as I used to. But it's if you are in the IT industry and you're not reading the Register.com, or I used to remember it as the register.co.uk because that was the only domain for a long time. You're doing yourself a disservice. It's really the only way
And
I can put
and
it.
every time somebody reads a Register story, my children get a bowl of rice.
Oh, well, there you go.
And if
That's
and
like
if you click on
those.
an ad, they get shoes.
All right, quick aside, even though we've just started, do you remember those websites in like the late 90s, early 2000s where it was like a click a day? You go click here and like we're
Hmm.
going to donate one basket of rice or a thing of wheat or whatever to some poor people probably in Africa.
Yep.
Yeah,
Who
I
knows
had
whether
those
that ever
like
happened?
yeah, I really hope it did. Because I clicked day for days and days and days. I'd go like it was like you couldn't have pinned tabs in the late 90s or early 2000s that didn't exist, but like they were like my favorites. Like I'd bring them up like
Mm,
one, two, three, four. Like
yeah.
I'm doing something good. I'm click was it slacktivism, clicktivism, whatever, like at its finest. Like
Clicktivism. Yeah,
yeah,
that
all I
sounds
have to
about right.
do is click and
Clicktivism.
I'm donating something from
Before
somebody's
hack, yeah,
paying, yeah,
before
before hacktivism.
hacktivism messed up all the visms.
Anyway, the register is great, and if you're into IT news at all, you should definitely go check that out. But Simon, you've been with the register for a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to become a journalist in the first place?
Oh, goodness me. So I'm a child of the late 60s, which means I'm also a child of the first wave of affordable microcomputers in the early 80s.
Yeah.
And my weapon of choice was the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. And back then, living in Australia, learning anything about the spectrum meant going to newsagents. Some of you may remember newsagents or newsstands, as I believe you say in American, North American, to buy magazines.
Yeah.
And I thought these magazines were really neat. And then I discovered a local user group that also had a magazine, and I did a little writing for that. And I suppose I had the bug and did a degree in post-structuralist, postmodernist theory, which didn't make any sense then and still makes no sense now. Found my way into journalism at the long forgotten PC Week Australia, where I founded the first daily IT web news in Australia and just kind of kept
Nice.
going.
That's awesome.
Um, Enterprise IT news continues to fascinate me. These are the technologies and the people that build and run the world we live in, and it's a privilege to follow the thread of what's going on in that industry and to write about the people who make it all happen.
Very cool. I spent a few years working for Infotech Research Group, which is basically a small Canadian Gartner or Forrester,
Mm-hmm.
CB Insights, that sort of firm. And so, yeah, I got really into, well, I'd already gone to school for enterprise IT tech, sysadmin, network admin type work, and then being able to get in there and actually talk to the people at Arista, Cisco, Juniper,
Yeah.
HP, Dell when they bought Arista, or they made a big networking acquisition back at the time and stuff like that. Yeah, it
Mm.
was actually really fun. Like, holy crap, you can do 40 gigabits per second. Like, I'm still having trouble getting 20 megabits at home. Like, this is amazing. So that was
Yeah,
really
I,
cool.
I, I remember we did a case study back in PC Week, probably in '96, of one of the very first wireless LANs. And it was a retirement village in the north of Sydney, Australia, that just happened to get
Nice.
hit by lightning a lot, and they were tired of their Cat 5 being blasted out of the lawn. So they put in Wi-Fi, which of course is an Australian invention.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And yeah, it was invented by our Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. And actually, I saw the first Wi-Fi access point the other day. It's kind of a big ass thing. Looks a bit like an Osborne One, for those of you who remember an Osborne One, but with
Yeah.
lots of knobs and oscilloma jiggers. Yeah. Anyway, there's a book that I keep meaning to write about that, but who has the time?
Yeah, well, especially when you're trying to keep up with what's happening now instead.
Yeah.
I was gonna make a joke about it looking like the venerable Linksys WRT54G because that wireless router just lasted forever. But yeah, I'm sure in prototype stage it didn't look anything like this little
No,
tiny
no, no.
blue
It
crab,
was
upside down crab.
no. It was a luggable. To be kind.
Nice, good stuff. People are gonna listen to this and be like, Derek is nerding out too much, and yeah, I am. So you got the bug for enterprise tech. You kind of already explained that. Right now, what sort of stories do you enjoy covering most?
Look, I've always really enjoyed just writing the stories of IT professionals
Mm.
as humans and as people who have careers and hopes and dreams and aspirations and want to leave the office at a decent time so they can take their kids to sport practice.
Yeah.
I'm continuing to, in my current role as APAC editor, we're trying to find the most interesting and most significant stories about what's going on in the Asia Pac region, which of course, is home to half of humanity, and present
Small
those
order.
stories to the world. Yeah, and also keeping an eye on the wonderful world of enterprise tech and the ongoing evolution of the software-defined stack and the software-defined data
Hmm.
center. Because again, these are the technologies that run the world, and they're changing
Yeah.
really quickly now.
Yeah. I just by virtue of where I worked and the fact that I was a huge networking nerd, I actually got to go to the first Open Networking Foundation conference at Stanford University back in the
Mm.
early 2000s, mid 2000s, I guess, or
Yeah.
no, late 2000s, where SDN was the big thing, software defined networking. Look at all the
Yep.
crazy things that we're going to be able to do once this matures a
Mm.
little bit, and
Mm.
um, and just like this conversation now, I was nerding out because I was talking to these lead researchers, not, marketing people, a few marketing people, but like lead researchers at Cisco, Juniper, HP,
Mm.
etc., who are really at the forefront and were literally building what will hopefully be a standard at the time so that everybody could build, on top of this more or less the same thing, as opposed to ending up
Mm.
with 3 or 4 different standards, quote unquote, because when you have four, it's not really a standard anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, like this, listening to panels of like still super early days of like what SDNs would actually allow us to do, and I'm like, oh my god, like software defined VLANs, like just so much easier to set
Yeah.
this stuff up and stuff like that. So yeah. Anyway, I guess my inner nerd is really showing this week. But that's super cool. Um, yes, the Asia Pacific region is absolutely half home to roughly half the world's population between India and China alone. Over 2 billion people out of the
Mm.
roughly eight that we have on the planet right now. But that's actually one of the reasons why I really enjoy having people from literally the other side of the world on the show, because there's nothing like you have I think probably a much different view of what's happening in China, India, Vietnam, Thailand, etc., than what we get over here. Most of our news agencies just don't care, especially about some of those latter countries that I mentioned, because the impact of something happening in Thailand could be huge for a neighboring country, but the chances that it
Mm.
impacts something here in Canada much smaller. So we just don't hear about it in most cases. But because you're geographically, at least, maybe not culturally, but geographically much closer, I think you probably hear a lot more about what's happening over there. And so, we've had people from restofworld.org and other
Mm.
publications like that
A
that
fine
really
publication.
try to,
Mm.
yeah, really try to help broaden, the news you get.
Mm.
So, in that vein, I think everybody knows about China's Great Firewall. It causes all sorts of problems in and outbound, mostly outbound for people living in China who
Mm.
want to access certain services. Cambodia, I guess about a year ago, proposed something I guess really similar, a national internet gateway, a single point for all internet traffic to enter and exit the country. My understanding is it's delayed, but can you tell us a little bit more about that and any thoughts
Yeah,
you have on,
sure,
on it, please?
sure. So look, I think to understand what's going on in Cambodia, we need to do a kind of lightning history lesson of how Cambodia through the 60s and 70s was kind of a pawn in the Cold War. And then in the 80s was ruled by a revolting genocidal dictator named Pol Pot, who literally killed about a third of the population, either with a famine that was pretty much deliberately engineered or from the barrel of a gun. And as the country started to stabilise in the mid 80s and the late 80s, it's actually a little known fact. The United Nations ran Cambodia for a few years there. It's
Oh,
the most activist that the United Nations has ever been. And they ran free and fair elections in 1993. And a chap called Hun Sen, who had previously been Prime Minister of Cambodia, kind of came second in that election. The party he led kind of came second, and he didn't really accept that. And so he had himself installed in a post of second Prime Minister, and he's been Prime Minister ever since. He overthrew the other parties, and today Cambodia is effectively a single party state. Opposition parties are banned. The ruling party holds every seat in the lower house of the nation's bicameral parliament, and there's only a handful of seats in the upper house that aren't controlled by Hun Sen's party. And of course, this stuff tends to follow a pretty predictable arc. The more restrictive a society becomes, the less representative a society becomes, the more people look for ways to express their anger with that.
mm-hmm.
Single party states then respond by clamping down on everything, so the media becomes less free.
Right,
You have a creeping police state. And this has been going on for years and years. And in February last year, Cambodia announced this national internet gateway, which, as you said, would be a choke point for all traffic into and out of the country and would include pretty broad surveillance capabilities. And the Cambodian government at that time said, no, 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 totally not about surveillance, totally not about cracking down on dissent,
nah,
totally not afraid of free discourse on the internet that could include dissent about our single party state. This is all about taxing ISPs and telcos properly. And nobody really believed that. And in the subsequent months, a bunch of NGOs, went and had a look at this proposal and essentially said, look, this is a great firewall, this is pervasive surveillance, and in the context of a single party state, this is not good news.
right,
So myself and a few others, as the implementation date of this thing neared, which I think was February 16 or 17 earlier this year, kind of pointed out that there was a country about to enter into an arrangement that looked an awful lot like a great firewall, and that this might
right,
not be a great thing. Um, and Cambodia's government, brought out the denials again. No, 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 totally not just about civil society. And then the day before it was due to go live, they said, actually, we're not going to do this because we haven't been able to purchase the equipment we need and set it up. And at first glance, this kind of looks like, the ultimate the dog ate my network excuse for not doing your homework. But there's an enormous core of plausibility to it because one of the things that's happened during COVID is, of course, massive disruption to technology supply chains.
sure,
And if you're thinking about the kind of equipment you need to build a national internet gateway, even for a smallish country, Cambodia is about 15 million people, you need some pretty high end kit to get that. Now, we know that the Ciscos, the Junipers, the Aristas are currently advising clients that they might have to wait a year to get their hands on some of their products.
mm,
And we also know that the big chip manufacturers are prioritizing stuff that they do in volume.
right.
So there's over 1 billion mobile phones or smartphones sold every year. So if you get an order for that, great, you will let your factory have a go at that. PCs, they're about 300 million a year market. We know that
Yeah.
cars are less than 100 million a year market, and that there have been big shortages of chips for cars. Now, if you look at
Yeah.
the kind of carrier grade kit that you need to run a national internet gateway, I think that you might be looking at 50,000 units a year for that kind of kit around the world. So the big
Right.
networking companies are well and truly back in the queue to get the kind of specialist silicon that Cambodia needs built. So it's actually entirely plausible that they can't buy the stuff they need. But here's where things get interesting. Because Cambodia is very much in China's orbit.
Yeah.
So
It's
it's
like
more
it's
natural.
a Laos or Vietnam away. Like it's not
Yeah,
doesn't border, but is damn close.
yeah, and politically, China has done what China does. It's made itself the best friend you can't stop liking.
Yes. Because if you do
Um,
stop liking them, they shoot you.
well, no, actually,
Or maybe lash.
it's really important, and China points this out, and they're correct, that China has not fired a shot in anger for nearly 50 years. So I think that's an important distinction to draw. China has other
Right.
ways of making its strength known. So, but Cambodia's a natural customer for Huawei or ZTE. So the
Hmm.
question becomes, why can't Cambodia get what it needs from a Chinese vendor? Now, there are two possible answers to that. One is that for whatever reason, Huawei and ZTE don't want to do business with Cambodia. And the other is they can't. That US sanctions have made it hard for them to develop that kind of
Right.
equipment, and that China has other priorities for where that equipment goes. So, one way or another, for now, Cambodia has been spared pervasive surveillance. Um, it's plausible the citizens of that nation have been spared because the equipment doesn't exist, but there may well be a deeper story to it about why
Hmm.
they can't get the Chinese kit.
Yeah. I named them because I know they've done things like this in the past. I don't know if they do anymore. They do it anymore, but I know Sandvine, a Canadian vendor, probably 2 hours up the road that way.
Mm.
Um, or not even if they're in Waterloo, it's only an hour and a half. But I know that their equipment has been used in that way before.
Mm.
I think in Turkey, Iran, Middle East, not China, but regardless, it's been, I would say, abused or misused, to engage in surveillance. But I mean, if it's a corporate network and you need to oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, it's like a legal man in the middle attack where you're actually decrypting and re-encrypting the traffic that's coming through the router to make sure everything's legit. But anyway, that sort of thing. Deep packet inspection, that type of tech.
Mm. Aha. Yep.
But at a massive scale, gigabits per second, terabits per second. Sandvine has a hardware that is capable of doing that. But ideally, it's for an open text. It's for an HP HQ. It's a Dell
Yeah.
HQ, etc. Google
Mm.
HQ to make sure data loss prevention and stuff like that is
Mm.
taking place, not to spy on your citizens. But I still think it's incumbent on companies like that to make sure that your gear is actually reaches a customer you want it to reach, especially
Mm-hmm.
in that sort of egregious situation. I like, obviously things go through resellers and stuff like that, and that's totally get that. That's fine. But when an Iranian IP address comes online and registers the hardware and gets the warranty all set up or
Yep.
whatever else,
Yep.
alarm bells should
Yeah.
be going off. But or Cambodian in this case, especially when there's very public news that that this sort of thing can happen. And I guess my only other, what I would add on there is that it was the day before it's supposed to go live, that all of a sudden this
Yeah.
revelation happens, that like, oh, we're not ready. Like, really, the day before you didn't
Mm.
know that 6 months ago or even 2 weeks ago? That part really, it just doesn't fly. But
It's a
I'm
weird one.
glad it hasn't happened.
Mm.
So it's a temporary win. I'll take it. But and hopefully the Cambodian people are happy that it hasn't happened yet. I'm sure there are some people who are sympathetic, but yeah, I guess we'll have to see what happens next. And people like Access Now, or organizations rather like Access Now, who we've had representatives on the podcast, the EFF, etc. The people who are actually working on this
mm.
sort of thing, probably the types of people you interviewed for some stories about this, continue to hammer on it, and hopefully it never sees the light of day. Hopefully they never get the hardware, and then they could spend that money on something else, like I don't know, better government benefits for people who need it, or something like that.
There's a lot of deserving people in Cambodia. It remains a very
I'm sure there
it,
is.
to be polite, it's at a comparatively early stage of development.
Sure. Yeah, I've met some what's the word? Um Refugees, I guess, of the
Mm,
Khmer Rouge.
mm,
They're here in Canada, moved the whole
mm,
family, and
mm,
thankfully got out alive. But yeah, it's not a topic I ask about. Obviously, I just know that they gone through it.
mm,
Uh, you mentioned China. Last few months or so, China's really come down on cryptocurrency mining, trade, reiterated their stance
mm,
on cryptocurrency trading not being allowed. Even here at Orchid, we've had some organizations try to help us build communities in China, and things just kind of fall apart because they don't want to promote a privacy preserving product in WeChat groups or even on Telegram, because they know that their identity can obviously be tied back to that and they can get in trouble. So
mm.
it's definitely been hard going there. That I mean, China's going to do what China's going to do, as you made clear earlier. Are you seeing that, or do you expect that to happen in any other countries, maybe within China's sphere of influence or elsewhere in APAC?
Look, I think around the world, we see that governments are increasingly interested in regulating cryptocurrency. And they're interested in regulating it mostly, I think, from a consumer protection point of view. I think that the market globally has figured out that most cryptocurrencies are a very poor means of exchange for day to day purchases.
Sure.
And I just don't see that happening. But India, Thailand have both recently essentially said, okay, well, look, we want to be able to see these transactions and tax them,
Hmm.
and make sure that this isn't a tool for money laundering. So, do I see mining bans? No. Do I see governments increasingly discouraging cryptocurrency transactions? Yes. When cryptocurrency is considered an asset or something akin to a security, governments are saying, essentially the genie is out of the bottle,
Yeah.
and people are going to trade in these instruments. But let's make those trades subject to rules similar to trades in any other assets. Well-regulated markets tend to do better. And the thing with China is China does not like unregulated anything. And the basic lens that I've been taught to look at China through is one that says the Chinese Communist Party does not share power with anyone.
Right.
And so the prospect of peer-to-peer communities and peer-to-peer currencies, it just runs counter to the way that China runs. But
Right.
I think there's something that people are missing a little bit with China's ban on mining Bitcoin. And that thing is that China has a policy of an enormous data center migration project.
Oh.
Um, China literally plans 10 new data center precincts in the west of the country, where it is cold and where they are very close to a lot of hydroelectricity, and in the future, a lot of solar power. And China literally has a policy of moving workloads that aren't latency sensitive out into the west of China.
Ah.
And even in the east, where they want the latency sensitive applications to be, they want to move them kind of out of the expensive real estate in the core of the city.
Sure.
And China wants to do this for a few reasons. They want their data centers to use more renewable electricity. They want to save their other forms of electricity for use in the cities. They want to do some regional stimulus. Now, China's Bitcoin miners figured this out ages ago. An awful lot of them operated out in the west of the country where land is cheap, where it's
Uh-huh.
cooler, which means it's cheaper to run your data center, and where that renewable electricity was. So
Right.
China has basically evicted people from the places that it has deemed a national priority for
Ah,
more regulated workloads. And the
interesting.
scale of this is enormous. I mean, the documentation I saw from the Chinese government a few weeks ago literally mentions 5 million racks of equipment are to
Wow.
be migrated to the west of China. Now, in a standard 40U rack, that could be
Yeah.
20, 20 dual socket servers times times 5 million.
Yeah.
Whoa.
That's a lot of horsepower or a lot of CPU power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So
yeah, no, I
I
wasn't
think
aware
I
of that.
think
So that
it's
that definitely helps shed some
yeah.
light on why. I mean, you could still it's still the sort of thing you'd be less likely to see here or in Australia, or it'd be done in a, I guess, in a more gentler way or something like that, where like, well, yeah, you bought the land and so now we need to procure the land from you, or maybe we'll go around you or whatever. Like, yeah, you kind of messed up our plans, but hopefully we can still make this work. Whereas, China's just like, it's not allowed anymore. Bye bye. Like, you know,
Look, China is unafraid to kill industries that it doesn't
yeah,
believe is in the national interest. So one of the things China did last year was it shut down online tutoring for school students. And this was a big thing.
interesting.
China with the legacy of the one child policy still very much
Hmm.
in play. There's a lot of pressure on children to do well, to get a good education. And so a lot of families were having their children, come home from school and then log on for extra online tutoring. It was a big industry. It employed a couple of 100,000 people.
I think I heard about
And
this
China
actually.
shut it, yeah, and China shut it down on grounds that A, children need some time to be children, and B, it felt that this was something in which more wealthy families were giving their children an edge. China has also quite happily shut down huge swathes of its gaming industry. So, bringing
Yeah.
a game to market in China requires government approval. They just stopped issuing approvals for 9 months.
Yeah, I
And
did
during
hear
that
about
time,
that.
it's estimated that 14,000 game studios went out of business. And the ones that are left are the big ones that are big
Yeah.
enough to have a party committee present, so that the government always has a hand in their decision making and their creative processes. So China does not have any qualms whatsoever about putting tens of thousands of people out of a job if they work in an industry that isn't felt to be in the national interest.
I would argue, and I think there's a good analog here already with film. I would argue that really good games coming out of China with some Chinese themes to them, or Chinese, very heavily in Chinese inspired art or style or what have you, actually helps boost China's image in the rest of the world. Like, I think it's 2/3 of Canadians don't trust the Chinese government. 80% of Germans, something like that. Like, I'm making up numbers right now, but I know they're quite
Mm.
high, and I'm sure in Australia it's also quite high, probably in the 60s or
So I
70s.
mean, look, this is a soft power argument.
Yeah,
Which is, for all of its flaws, the United States remains the world's soft power superpower. People see American movies and hear American music, and that imparts American values to them. Japan has outsized soft power through Hello
anime,
Kitty and
manga,
anime
or yeah,
and manga. The UK has always had extraordinary soft power through its music and, for 400 years from a bloke called Shakespeare. China's soft power is not strong by comparison. TikTok is a huge win for China. It's the first time they've really captured a global zeitgeist, and
yeah.
China's pretty pleased with that. And also, a lot of Tencent's mobile games are also starting to do that for them. I know that the works of science fiction author Cixin Liu, the Three Body Problem trilogy.
Yeah.
China's pretty happy that the global geekdom has found that trilogy fascinating. So China is keenly aware that it doesn't have enormous soft power, and is very pleased that that's starting to change.
Sure. And I thought it was maybe 10-cent pictures, but I guess not. But there have been a few animated films come through Netflix that are just pretty much Chinese start to finish, except that everything's happening in English. And my kids love them. Like it's
Mm,
and I'm watching it with a very skeptical eye. Like where does the propaganda fit in here? But I'm letting them watch the movie. Like I don't have a problem with
mm,
that. And I'm having the more adult eye to it. And I'm like, this is just good entertainment and like, cool Chinese ancient lore type stuff weaved in here, and I think that's really cool. And so I'm just thinking that like they've done really well in that film space, starting to get there in literature, etc. I think that they are, maybe because they're a bunch of old guys. I was gonna say old white guys, but they're not old white guys. They're old Asian guys, old Chinese men, primarily in power. They're not looking at the video game industry as a potential additional arm into that soft power. We even saw game cancellations and delays recently because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where either definitely some game studios in Ukraine or some people now who've been caught up in things on the Russian side, can't release what they're trying to do
mm,
because Russia's largely been sanctioned. Netflix pulled out 700,000 customers. Poof. And Steam won't let Russian game studios publish to the Steam store, or Valve won't let them publish to the Steam store, stuff like that.
mm,
So it's not 14,000 game studios, but it is some highly anticipated video games coming from talented people, regardless of where they're from. And I
mm,
don't know if there's Russian lore, baked in there or what have you, but to me, anything that makes you, your culture, your country, etc., look better, you should be helping put forth. Canadian TV and movies doing really, really well right now, and even in the States, which it's historically done not done so well in. And I think it just exposes people to a new culture, to new ways of thinking, etc., and just makes things look better in the long run. So I would argue it that, not that you're necessarily putting up the argument here, but I would argue with the Chinese Communist Party and say that was a bad move, right, in the long run. And holding off licenses for 9 months, which I did hear about, and I know they just issued like 5 or 6 in the last week or so. Finally, taking down this wall that that they had up for a long time on the game approvals. It's literally putting people out of business, which is only making the people who live in the country feel worse about their government. And then when we hear about stuff like that happening on the outside, we're like, dude, like, what the hell's your problem? Um, to put it in a very
different
blunt way.
values,
Yeah,
different
yeah,
values.
for sure. Cool. All right. I very quickly, you had mentioned that some governments, especially in APAC, are looking at consumer protection. Depending on the product, sure, totally get that. And I only raised this because in the Defiant the other day, I read about this person. I'm not sure if it's a man or a woman. Nessa Risley, I'm going to guess woman, from North Carolina in the United States, who is suing Uniswap because she spent $10,400 on low capitalization altcoins. The Defiance words like Ethereum Max, Matrix Samurai, Rocket Bunny, Bezos Earth, and Boom Baby tokens. And I thought to myself, really? Those are the those are the tokens? Those are the altcoins you thought you were going to make a buck on? I'm not sure you deserve that $10,400 in the first place, but that you had to blow apparently. And plus, no matter whether it's crypto or traditional trading, buying stocks and stuff like that, you never put in more money than you can afford to lose. Like, come on, rule
Hmm.
number one. But anyway, okay. Uh, One more thing about China. I think everybody's seen out of Shanghai and maybe to a lesser extent Shenzhen. The lockdown there it appears to be quite extreme,
Mm,
violent even, with at least some of the videos I've seen. I can't verify the veracity of it, and I'm well aware of that. But I saw a Chinese Twitter account posting a bunch of videos which appeared to show authorities, quote unquote, knocking down doors, being incredibly intimidating to people, very much directly questioning people of like, did you say this thing online about the government or about the lockdown or stuff like that? And I was like, holy smokes! Like, what are you seeing there? Especially from what we see, massive food shortages, food also getting thrown out. Like I saw some of that in some of those videos. Um, Protests that are getting very violently shut down, stuff like that. It like from your perspective, are you seeing the same news? I think it's legitimate. Is it happening? And
Look, it
if
it
so,
it
do you
it
go ahead?
we it is certain that Shanghai is under a very strict lockdown. It is certain that there are a number of people who are not happy about that. And the reason they're not happy about it is that the Chinese people understand that they live less free than many people in other parts of the world.
Hmm.
But they understand that when China is disunited, China has a long history of very chaotic and violent times. And in the family memories of most Chinese people, would be stories of, of famine in China. And
Yeah,
they now live in a time of great prosperity and security. And they understand that, that essentially comes from their form of governance. So it is rare for people to challenge it. Um, when people criticise the government, they can often do it quite subtly. There's a word in Chinese that can mean alpaca, as in the cute llama-like creature, and can also be a very crude sexual term. And so there's quite a thing among Chinese tourists of visiting alpaca farms when they travel abroad. So they can kind of legitimately use this naughty word on social media that would otherwise get them tripped up. So it is, I think, a reasonably extraordinary moment that people are being critical of the government online at this time. China runs a zero COVID policy. Look, in Australia, we just about got to zero COVID in the second half of 2020. Um, we're an enormous island and nobody could get in without spending 2 weeks locked in a hotel room, in hotel quarantine. Much harder in a country the size and the population of China to stop the virus. So I don't doubt that there is currently dissent, and that there is a strong hand being used to remind those dissenting of their responsibilities to, as we say in Australia, suck it up.
okay, fair enough.
Um, that's how China runs.
Yeah, well, yeah, that is, for better or worse, definitely how it runs. I
Mm,
feel like they're starting to. I mean, I don't have a ton of context realistically before I make this statement. I feel like at least as long as I've been aware of what life is like in any sort of way in China, it feels like there's more and more dissent, especially since COVID started, but even before then. And I know that the Chinese government often comes after people who have left but are still critical. You're a Chinese citizen, and
yep.
therefore you still have certain responsibilities
Yep.
um, to the Chinese Communist Party, to the country, etc. So
Mm-hmm.
much so that you're not allowed to hold dual citizenship, is my understanding. And a woman I used to work with had to renounce her Chinese citizenship in order to get Canadian citizenship. She was
Mm,
perfectly happy to do so because she did grow up in China before coming to Canada to go to college. So she
mm,
certainly had enough experience to be like, I don't want to have a Chinese passport anymore. That's fine. She still has family in China though, and I don't know what it's like now to go back and forth to visit them, but
mm,
yeah, she was more than willing to make that choice to have to renounce her Chinese citizenship and take a Canadian one instead. So,
yeah.
which I think for most people is no small feat. Like that's a big deal.
Mm,
Especially when you're born and raised there, your parents still live there at least half the time, and that sort of thing. So, okay. Is there anything? the US, Canada, maybe the UK can learn from countries in the APAC region when it comes to government internet surveillance. Probably, hopefully, it's that it's a losing battle at some point. But um, yeah, any
Ah,
lessons you've seen maybe that we could learn before we head down a certain path?
I think the really interesting example is India, actually, because India has a really vivid online rights ethos. I'm sure that you and the viewers remember the big scandal last year about NSO Pegasus, the spyware that's supposed to be used by governments
For
to
sure,
probe
yeah.
the worst of the worst, and which was widely abused. That remains an issue in India today. There's an inquiry going on, and India has this kind of perpetual indignance about online privacy to an extent that I don't see in other nations. People are really
Mm.
concerned about it. They're really concerned about how big tech is accessing their data. And they're really concerned. I mean, India knows what it's like to be colonized. um,
Yeah.
and India doesn't remember that fondly. And India is pretty keen to make sure that its economy isn't colonized by big tech.
Mm.
So I think that certainly looking at the level of agitation about privacy and surveillance, corporate surveillance in India, is something that governments around the world could do a lot worse than to consider. I think it would be interesting if other populations around the world became more interested in that. But then, having said that, there are also examples of other nations in the region where people accept that their governments may be more intrusive than other governments might be in other places. So, I mean, Singapore is a resource poor, tiny speck of a nation in which most citizens enjoy, very much a first world lifestyle and first world
Yeah.
services, and people understand that there's a trade off there, and that a little self censorship makes their lives often considerably easier. So. That's not a model that I would like many other nations to consider.
Self-censorship
Um,
and mandatory military service.
yeah, Yeah. So
I think I
I
think
think that
those two
there's
things probably go really well hand in hand. Where
yeah.
you probably grew up with your parents telling you, "Hey, you be careful what you say out in public," and that sort of thing. And then you go to the military at 18, and are doing your
Mm,
2 week stints, 3 week stints, etc. For basic training, and then beyond that, and like I'm sure certain values being hammered in at that time because well it's the military
mm,
and up until the 90s, I think, maybe even the early 2000s, Portugal also had mandatory military service. I think Switzerland still
mm,
does. And these are typically, really small population countries who feel like if we don't do this, we're not going to have a military of any kind. And,
yeah.
who knows what could happen because
Mm,
even the last few hundred years have, maps have changed quite a bit, quite
yeah.
significantly. Um, yeah,
But let's not forget too that APAC nations can look back at the West and find some pretty nifty models for surveillance too.
sure.
So Australia has got pretty comprehensive legislation that requires platforms and technology companies to cooperate with investigations, even down to some really detailed technical reveals. Some of the stuff Edward Snowden revealed certainly indicates that the US has got some pretty comprehensive ways of surveilling what goes on in commercial networking kit. So there's if you really want to get out there and do some surveillance and privacy invasion, there are lots of playbooks all over the world to learn from.
Yeah, lots of NSA generated and exploited backdoors into Cisco gear. I remember a little while ago and stuff like that. So I remember Cisco
Mm.
being quite upset about it. So at
Yeah.
least it didn't seem like they were in on it. But yeah, it's that sort of stuff definitely happens.
Mm.
Okay, coming up to time here, so I just want to see if we can sneak in one more question. Um, for your day to day, what sort of impact does that censorship actually have on journalism and the types of things that you're able to cover? And do you think it's going to get any better or worse over the next little while?
I think the most chilling form of censorship is self-censorship.
Hmm,
Are the stories you don't explore, or the stories you know not to explore. And that could be because they will create uncomfortable personal circumstances. Or it could be that there are other incentives that you feel you might miss out on. Um, so, you know, in journalism generally, there's a term called access journalism,
right.
where people just stop talking to you, stop answering your questions if you're perceived to be hostile. Or not even hostile. I mean, most of the time, people stop talking to you just because they don't want to engage with the fact that you're asking them difficult questions. So there can sometimes reach a point where, as a working journalist, um, you just don't ask questions because you know they won't be substantively answered,
Right.
and that's a form of censorship. That's when those in power censor their own voices, so that they won't find themselves discussed in the public sphere, or so that they won't have to discuss matters that concern them in the public sphere. I have a long running argument with certain people in the marketing and media relations communities, about PR disasters. And I argue there's no such thing as a PR problem, it's always a behaviour problem.
Hmm,
And when you've
yeah,
behaved
usually.
badly, you suddenly decide that it's not legitimate for people to write about it. So I think that kind of censorship, censorship of discussion about your own flaws and your own behaviour, that can sometimes flow into self-censorship by media, because stories get too hard, too uncomfortable to cover. Um, I think those are more pervasive and more difficult than hard censorship. Having said that, I think we're blessed to live in an age when, the means of production for journalism, essentially distributing journalism, is now possible in so many more ways than was previously possible.
Right.
If your website gets down, you can probably get a Telegram channel. There are ways.
Yeah.
There are so many ways. I think though that the tricky thing is to establish credibility in those channels. I'm very fond of the maxim that quality media stands out with the quality of its apologies and retractions. And I'm certainly not saying that mainstream media are perfect or that I'm perfect. But I think that when news gathering and publishing organisations are willing to share and explain and own up to their mistakes and their errors, that's an enormous sign of credibility. And I don't see that kind of behaviour in a lot of the stuff that uses various technological means to evade censorship.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Like that's a great set of parting words. Um, and thanks for writing about issues like Infosys leaving Russia, HCL and HP and the audit of India's biometric system, which, if I recall correctly, is called Aadhaar. Samsung, God, like at the top, they just are always seem to be running into issues, and other topics like that. People should definitely just go check out the register.com, look up your name, Simon Sharwood, and see some of the stories. Looks like you've done some collaborations as well that don't come up just when we look just for your name,
Just
but some
Google
other co.
Google me, and if you're in my Twitter, just ignore all the stuff about Australian sports. They're incomprehensible and weird,
Cricket is
and yeah,
so
just.
weird. Like I don't get it. And I see you're a Sydney Roosters fan, and that's fine. Like I'm not gonna poop on you for liking cricket, but I just don't get it. Like it is very much a very APAC and England thing.
Yeah, I've actually taken a vow. I'm never going to try and explain cricket to Americans again. But rugby league, now
Oh, hey,
you all should be paying attention to rugby league, because that's huge guys smashing into each other for 80 minutes with no pads.
I love rugby. I love rugby. I was actually watching the HSBC Sevens in Vancouver this past
Ah, there
weekend.
you go.
It's coming up in
Mm,
Langford, BC, either this weekend or the weekend after that. Before the pandemic started, every single weekend I was watching HSBC Sevens because I and A, the Canadian women are really good. B, the Canadian men were
mhm,
actually doing much better than I than I thought they would, and we're taking down some not top tier teams. Like they were not taking down the All Blacks or the Wallabies or the Springboks by any means, but they were taking down some. I think they beat Nigeria at one point. They beat Scotland or Ireland, and I was like, "Holy smokes, we're actually doing
mm,
okay. This is good." Pretty sure we beat Scott. The Canadian men beat Scotland on the weekend. So anytime we could take it down a
mm,
European team, I'm absolutely thrilled with my countrymen and countrywomen for doing that. Now we need to start to take down the Australasian teams. Fiji's really good. Samoa's really good. Australia, of
mm.
course, and New Zealand are really good. And of course South Africa and even England is definitely top tier. So when we can start to take down, at least compete with those teams, if not win, I'll be super thrilled. At least on the men's side, the women can do it fairly well already, and have actually won weekend tournaments, but or at least they did back in
Cool.
2020.
And we'll
So
convert you to cricket some other decade.
some of the lifetime. Just I'm gonna have to come back as a Kiwi, as an Australian or something, or an Indian person or something like that next time
Yeah.
around in order to get into cricket. It looks baseball-esque, but I know there's all these crazy rules, and the way you have to
Hmm.
pitch the ball looks ridiculous, and all this other stuff. So if you love it, that's great. And that's fine. I like American football, so there's my downfall, and Canadian football to a lesser extent. It's not as exciting, I find, but either way, we all have our things that we probably shouldn't like, but we do anyway.
Cool.
All right, thanks a lot again for your time, Simon, and for
Thanks,
everybody who's
Derek.
listening. Sorry for geeking out so hard, but until next time, stay free.